I'm so excited to introduce you all to Robyn if you don't know her. Robyn Hiestand is a vice president at Bose Public Affairs Group and a member of the Federal Relations team. And prior to joining Bose, Robyn spent 20 years working in government and nonprofit organizations from the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, College Promise Campaign, and Education Trust. And additionally, as a principal of her own consulting company, she worked with the Gates Foundation and the Bipartisan Policy Center on issues related to higher education policy and finance. Robyn is a veteran PNPI presenter and speaker. We really rely on her to help educate the community about the federal budget process. And I'm excited that she's here to drill down and talk about reconciliation in particular. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robyn. Again, she will present, and then we'll have some discussion and Q&A, and make sure that you leave feeling really confident about the fundamentals and the foundations of the budget reconciliation process. So Robyn, thanks for being here. Turn it over to you, and anyone can enter questions in the Q&A box at any point. But thanks for being here, Robyn.
Thank you, Betsy, Austin, Mary Ellen, for again inviting me to present about reconciliation process. Good to see so many familiar names pop up. I'm here to walk you through reconciliation. I've worked on 2 education titles of reconciliation measures. In 2007, there was the College Cost Reduction Act, a little different from the one that's being debated now. Passed into law in 2007, and then again a few years later I worked on the Student Aid and Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was an education title that was part of a broader overall healthcare reform title that was within the first term of the Obama administration. Again, happy to be here this morning. I am going to start sharing my screen and get into reconciliation. Here we go. Okay, so what is reconciliation? Reconciliation is a budget process outlined in the Congressional Budget Act, and it's a process to get spending, revenue, and debt limits in line with what the Budget Committee writes in a budget resolution. And to do that, Congress often has to do some things that are politically unpopular, such as cut spending and or increase taxes or raise the debt limit. The reconciliation process is the prerogative of Congress, and the budget committees govern its consideration. It is an optional process. Nothing happens if there is no budget resolution or budget reconciliation. But it's a way to get legislation through Congress as opposed to what is called regular order. And regular order would be spending bills go through the appropriations process, or big authorization measures go through the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee and the Education and Workforce Committee, and then through the respective chambers. Reconciliation circumvents some of that. There's usually very high-level policy consideration that governs reconciliation. Generally, at least it's been the case in the past 20 years, reconciliation happens when there's unified government. That means one party controls both the House, Senate, and the White House. That wasn't always the case in the 80s, and I think in the early 90s, there was reconciliation measures that passed with a little bit of divided government. Both the House and the Senate must draft a budget resolution, pass it through committee and through their respective chambers, and then conference that budget resolution and pass the conference budget resolution. The budget committees must instruct specific committees. So the Finance Committee, if it's on taxes, or if it's going to be on education, you would instruct the Health Committee, or the Education Workforce, or the Appropriations Committee has received some reconciliation instructions. You instruct the committees that have the programmatic oversight. And reconciliation covers roughly, well, it does cover 3 subjects. So you can have 3 different reconciliation measures within one fiscal year budget resolution. It could cover taxes, it can cover spending, and it can cover the debt limit. And the debt limit could be pretty important come January, because I think that's when we will hit our debt limit. Let's see. So the reconciliation process. I have the seal of the US Senate here because it is a very big deal to do reconciliation in the Senate. And it is a big deal because the Senate has a tradition of governing by what's called unanimous consent agreements. You get the consent of all 100 senators, and also because of the filibuster, which has gotten a lot of press over the past couple of years. In the Senate, you have various motions that you need 60 votes. So there's a motion to proceed. That motion to proceed, that's just a motion to go to a bill. That is debatable, that you need 60 votes in order to move to a bill. The motion to invoke cloture, that's the motion to end debate on a bill. You also need that. You also need 60 votes in order to end debate on a bill. But with reconciliation, it cuts it off. You do not need 60 votes, you need 51 votes. There is no motion to proceed, you are going to the measure. It's a fast track through the US Senate. And there are limits on debate. After 20 hours, you are moving to the bill, you're moving to final passage. So you're not in a situation where the Senate is talking and talking and talking and talking on a bill for days to weeks at a time. Let's see, there are strict rules that govern what provisions or amendments can be considered in reconciliation, and those are subject to interpretation by the Senate parliamentarian. Provisions in reconciliation must be germane to the committee that is instructed. So what does that mean? That means if the Senate Finance Committee or the House Ways and Means Committee is instructed to do something on taxes, a senator can't put forward an amendment that revises student loan debt or income-based repayment, because the Ed and Workforce Committee is not instructed and the Senate Health Committee is not instructed. So amendments must be germane to the very topic. That's not the case if you're going through regular order in the Senate. You can do any kind of amendments. Limits on debate, as I had mentioned, 20 hours. Senators cannot filibuster reconciliation. And then after that 20 hours expires, you go into what is called vote-a-rama. So vote-a-rama can get pretty hairy on the Senate floor. It's a brutal fight. You're sending toxic amendments to each party back and forth, back and forth. It can get very nasty very quickly, and it can go on until exhaustion. During vote-a-rama, anything goes. These amendments do not have to be budget related. You have senators who take these votes during vote-a-rama have to be very careful for a couple of reasons. One, if you are up for re-election and it's going to be a competitive, you need to be mindful of how this is going to play back home. And then the second reason is because if you get too many of these toxic amendments that are unrelated to the budgetary nature of reconciliation, the parliamentarian can bring down the entire reconciliation bill. And vote-a-rama goes until exhaustion. Usually whenever there's talk of reconciliation, there's always talk about the Byrd Rule. The Byrd Rule was established in the mid-80s as a rule to guide reconciliation in the US Senate, and it was codified into law about 5 years later. It's named after the late Senator Robert Byrd, who's the longest serving US senator. He was known to argue in favor of preserving very antiquated, some would say, traditions and decorum, specifically within the federal budget and spending process, and within the US Senate. There are 6 provisions of the Byrd Rule outlined here. And according to the Congressional Research Service, the most common violation of the Byrd Rule is that a provision does not produce a change in outlay or revenues, or it's not budgetary in nature, which would make it a policy provision. Certain provisions in law if you're familiar with the tax cuts, they sunset after so many years. And the reason that that happens is because of the Byrd rule and Byrd rule number 5, that you can't increase the deficit beyond the time frame that reconciliation outlines. As a courtesy, usually what happens with reconciliation is there is what's called a Byrd bath, and that is when staff of the various committees that are instructed. So let's say in this case, it's the Senate Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee, as well as the Ed and Workforce Committee. They will go down and talk to the parliamentarian and make arguments on various policy provisions, to say that, to make the argument that they are budgetary in nature and not policy in nature. After the Byrd bath, and the parliamentarian is sort of given a sense of if she thinks something is budgetary or policy, then the chairs of the budget committee will outline provisions in the congressional record that they believe violate the Byrd bath. Again, it is subject to interpretation by the Senate parliamentarian, and that can kind of play into dynamics between the chambers, between the House and the Senate. Generally, House members do not like the fact that the scorekeepers, Joint Committee on Taxation, Congressional Budget Office, as well as the parliamentarian have so much power to guide legislation. It's very hard to overrule the parliamentarian. You need 60 votes, you need 60 senators to waive a Byrd rule violation should one be raised. And generally when there is a motion to waive the Byrd rule, those are unsuccessful. Again, House members feel that reconciliation process and the power of the parliamentarian distorts the balance of power between the House and Senate, and it gives too much power to an unelected officials to interpret the Byrd rule. Previous reconciliation bills, there have been 23 bills enacted into law or have been vetoed. Some of these that I've outlined here happened during the Clinton administration and into the George W. Bush administration. The 1993 Omnibus Reconciliation Act, I put that one there because that's where you see the emergence of the direct lending program. 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Act. That was, as President Clinton was going into a re-election, some would call that the welfare reform reconciliation bill. 1997, there was 2 reconciliation bills after Clinton is re-elected. One relates to spending, the Balanced Budget Act, and then one relates to Taxpayer Relief Act. I believe the Taxpayer Relief Act did have the Hope and Lifetime Learning tax credits, so that there are elements of education and higher education that are in these reconciliation bills. The big tax bill when Bush is elected in 2001, and then there was the Deficit Reduction Act, which had some provisions on, I believe it was ACG and SMART grants, which are supplemental grants for Pell eligible students to go into high need fields. More recent reconciliations is the one Mary Ellen and I worked on, the College Cost Reduction Act from 2007. The elements in the green are what the money was spent on. The elements in the red is how they paid for it. So in 2007, we reduced what was called special allowance payments and other payments to lenders in the Federal Family Education Loan Program. That was a private loan program that we used to have. And we put that money into a mandatory Pell, which we still have today. It makes Pell very complicated. We established income-driven repayment and public service loan forgiveness, which has obviously been in the press over the past couple of years, as now students are eligible, or borrowers are now eligible for public service loan forgiveness. Also put a little bit of money into TRIO funding and college access grant funding. Obama is elected in 2008, and in his budget, he proposes some pretty ambitious changes to higher education. One was that he wanted mandatory Pell, completely moving it from the discretionary side of the budget onto the mandatory side of the budget. That didn't necessarily happen because of budget considerations and the cost of it. But the other big thing that he did was he eliminated the old bank-based or the federal family education loan program. And we went from two different programs to one program, which was direct lending. We put money into Pell again. We had an inflation adjustment for Pell. We shored up the program because it was running deficits because this was during the Great Recession. We put money into this just nonprofit student loan servicing, as well as HBCUs, TCUs, minority serving institutions, expanded income-based repayment. Changed the dynamics a little bit with that bill of higher education, because it used to be that you would go after, the banks on the student lending side in order to pay for the student benefits. Now, the government is making the loans, the student loans. So any changes that you do are going to cost some money. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic now. 2001, the American Rescue Plan, when Biden came in, obviously it was during the pandemic. So a lot of money for higher education, recovery and relief, but also some money towards student aid administration, Howard and Gallaudet. So this gets a little complicated and wonky. But now there is, you can do two different reconciliation bills within one calendar year. And the way that this sort of unfolded was when Trump came in, was when he was first elected. He wanted to do, and before he was even inaugurated, Congress passed a budget resolution because he had signaled that he wanted to overturn the Affordable Care Act. The parliamentarian said that you could have two different spending related or tax related or debt, you can have two different reconciliation measures in 1 year. So Congress, they're inaugurated in early January. They quickly got to work on drafting a reconciliation measure. And they did a reconciliation measure looking at last year's budget window, because the previous Congress hadn't done one. So they're like, we're going to do a catch-up one and we're going to write one. And the parliamentarian said that they could do that. So they did a reconciliation measure that covered fiscal years 17 through 26. And it was quickly passed through the House and Senate before Trump was even inaugurated. It was a reconciliation measure to overturn the Affordable Care Act. And it passed the House in May of 2017. It did not pass the Senate. This is the famous John McCain vote where he came in and voted no. And then quickly after the reconciliation, the Affordable Care Act overturned. It did not happen. Trump released his budget in May. Congress quickly got to work again on reconciliation for tax reform, and they were successful in that. But again, notice that they updated the numbers, since they had already done a reconciliation measure covering the 10 years between fiscal 17 through 26. They had to move it forward 1 year to fiscal 18 to 27. And I know there's some of you on the call that watched that reconciliation tax bill, that there was some provisions related to higher education. I think that there was stuff on reforming student loans, tax deduction. I think it's like a $2,000 tax deduction. I think they want to get rid of, and I think there was elements on endowment that they changed or wanted to change. Biden comes in, he does the same thing. So Biden is inaugurated, Congress gets to work, a week or two later, they do an updated budget resolution because again, the previous Congress, the 116th Congress, hadn't done a conference budget resolution. And they do reconciliation instructions to 12 committees. This is the American Rescue Plan to do pandemic recovery. And again, it moves very, very quickly. And it is signed into law within the first 100 days. In May, the president's budget is released, and then Congress moves to do a second reconciliation bill. Again, this is with different fiscal year numbers, fiscal 22 through 31, different 10-year budget window. And it's also a spending bill. And that one gets a little complicated because the House moves the bill called Build Back Better. The Senate doesn't. The Senate ultimately takes that and does the Inflation Reduction Act, which was very different than what was initially proposed. So what it was in Build Back Better, or whatever you wanted to call it, there was a lot of education provisions in the House passed reconciliation bill, about 500 billion. There specifically as it relates to higher education, student aid, Pell, support for teachers and school leaders, support for HBCUs, tribal colleges, HSIs, and other MSIs. There was institutional aid as well as retention and completion grants. And then, sort of outside higher ed, universal preschool, early education, food and nutrition provisions, and then workforce training. Again, none of this came to pass because Build Back Better eventually became Inflation Reduction Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act did not have any education-related provisions. So in summary, what is reconciliation? Reconciliation is an optional process outlined by the Congressional Budget Act under the jurisdiction of the budget committees. It is a very, very big deal in the Senate because it circumvents Senate process and procedures. It cuts off the filibuster. Amendments have to be specific and germane as it relates to the Byrd Rule. And then you have, in the past 5 years, there's been a parliamentarian ruling that you can have 2 budget resolutions within 1 calendar year with reconciliation. And that was done in 2017 when Trump was in his first year in office, and again in 2021 when Biden was in his first year in office. So with that, I will close it out and take any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Robyn. We do have a question, and feel free to add questions you might have in the Q&A box, but I wanted to ask a couple of things before we jumped into those. And one was, I recognize the sort of procedural advantage that you outlined for the Senate for this, but what about the House? Is it correct to say that the House has already mechanisms for limiting debate and amendments and stuff? Is there a procedural advantage to do this for reconciliation in the House? Or is it truly just a big deal in the Senate? But is there any advantage to have in the House?
So the House is structured a little differently in terms of you have the House Rules Committee. So whenever legislation goes through regular order, it'll go through the committee process. And then, members of that specific committee will have, yes or no vote, opportunity to offer an amendments. But then before it goes to the full chamber of the House, all 435 members, it goes through the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee determines how things are going to be debated on the House floor and what amendments are going to be offered. So it's a little bit of a different structure where in the Senate, there is really no Rules Committee. It's kind of an open process on the Senate floor. So when it comes to reconciliation, yeah, it is a big deal in the Senate. I'd have to go back and look at what role does the Rules Committee play in terms of reconciliation, but I'm guessing that it's pretty much the Congressional Budget Act and the chair of the budget committee is pushing this through. And keep in mind too, that reconciliation happens when there's unified government, and these are very high level conversations that are happening between the White House, the Speaker's office, and the Senate Majority Leader, and then, the respective chairs of the committee. And, they make sure that the ships are going to run on time. So.
Thank you. That's helpful. And could you if you were to summarize kind of the impact that the reconciliation process has had specifically on federal student aid policy, how would you summarize that? It's been a significant impact, insignificant. I don't know. How would you kind of summarize for this audience in particular, how reconciliation has impacted like what we know as a federal student aid policy today?
Pretty much like over the past 10 to 15 years, any kind of big major muscle movement on higher ed has been done through reconciliation. So mandatory Pell, or the mandatory add-on to Pell, or the Pell shortfall, all done through reconciliation. Public service loan forgiveness, reconciliation. Increases to HBCUs. I mean, there has been some efforts that have been done on the appropriation side, but there's been some significant gains as in funding through the reconciliation process. Income-driven repayment, which is getting a lot of press as of late as it relates to student loan debt forgiveness. It was done through 2007 SAFRA. It was 15% of discretionary income and forgiveness after 25 years. A few years later, in 2010, we amended that to 10% of your discretionary income and forgiveness after 20 years. So all done through reconciliation. So I would say pretty significant. And let's not forget student loan servicing. There was just a hearing last week on student loan servicing. And MOHELA was involved in that. At one point, MOHELA was a state nonprofit doing loans. So yes, significant changes to federal student aid have been done through reconciliation. Despite the efforts, I should say, of the authorizing committees to try to move legislation. So with that, I would say if you wanted to like nerd out on, what could happen in the next, I don't know, 5 to 6 months and what kind of reconciliation measures as it relates to higher ed, I would take a very close look at the House bill, the Build Back Better. May not be exactly what is being discussed, but you'll get the themes and the parameters of the debate. And also, dust off the 2017 tax debate, Trump tax cuts, to kind of refresh yourself on what they were thinking in terms of tax reform as it relates to higher education.
Thanks. And you alluded to this a little bit when you mentioned authorizers. But what are some of the criticisms of using the reconciliation process to push through some of this major legislation? Is it, partially, obviously, authorizers might prefer to go about this in a different way and advance legislation? Are there other kinds of criticism for the reliance on or use of reconciliation?
Well, I think one of the big criticisms is, you have to have a budgetary lens to this and not necessarily a policy lens. And so you can't have pages and pages of allowable uses and, authorized legislation, because it's just not going to pass muster with the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian wants to see, kind of a streamlined bill that has a budgetary impact. So that's one criticism of the reconciliation process. Another criticism is that, you're jamming the other side. It especially in the past 15 years, it has been a partisan process. It has, you're limiting the ability of the minority party to offer amendments to improve the legislation. So, and then, there's the whole balance of power thing. You have the Senate parliamentarian making these calls and not, the subject matter experts of the authorizing and appropriations committee. So those I would say are the three big ones.
Yeah. I want to get to a couple of questions here submitted. So someone asked if you could talk a little bit more on that decision of ruling something budgetary in nature versus policy in nature. So they comment, for example, College Cost Reduction Act, CBO marked it as a cost saver, but significantly reorganizes the federal student loan program. So, it seems to make policy versus just be budgetary. So could you sort of talk that through a little bit? You can use that as example or something else, but how is that process really playing out in real life? And how do you make that distinction sometimes between budget and policy?
Yeah, so at the very beginning of my presentation, I said these are my opinions. I'm not the Senate parliamentarian, and so maybe I should just reiterate that. But I think that's a really good question because the bill that Chair Fox has drafted, it's doing some big changes as it relates to student loans, and it does save. And I think that is where like you need to have like good staff making the case in front of the Senate parliamentarian. And that's again where the budgetary lens has to come through. And you have to make the case that this is a budgetary, the reason we're doing it is to reduce lending and not necessarily to reorganize or change incentives in higher education. And I think you really need to go through if let's say the College Cost Reduction Act were to go through reconciliation, you take out any extraneous policy provision, make sure it's tight, make sure that there's not 300 pages of authorizing text, that it's maybe down to 30 pages. Because that's all kind of and then there's not just Elizabeth McDonough, the Senate parliamentarian staff, there's also 3 or 4 other associated parliamentarians that are going to be asking questions. Think of it like a court. You're going to court, and you really have to make the case and know the argument. But again, like you need strong staff. They need to know the bill inside and out, and it's ultimately up to the Senate parliamentarian to make a determination as to what is actually policy and what is budgetary. There was an example a few years ago that predates me, and I think the Senate parliamentarian has overturned it, but there was a provision as it relates to oil and gas drilling in Alaska. ANWR, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and it scored, in the billions because you would be opening up the North Shore of Alaska. But I believe it was in the early 2000s that the parliamentarian decided, well, this isn't really about the budgetary savings. This is about oil and gas drilling in Alaska. And so that was considered a big win for, I guess, Democrats at the time. I don't know if that ruling still stands. But yeah, you need to know your stuff and be prepared to argue.
And I can't remember if you addressed this or not, but who appoints the parliamentarian? How does that position sort of fit in terms of hierarchy? And I know you mentioned sort of folks, criticizing because it's not an elected position, but holds a lot of power. But who appoints that position, or how does that role fit in?
So the Senate Majority Leader does appoint the parliamentarian. Usually, it is it a political appointment? Yes and no. Like, I would say that, when there's an opening, that is when the Senate Majority Leader, whoever that may be, Mitch McConnell, Schumer, whoever replaces Mitch McConnell. Having said that, there was, I believe it was Frist at the time in 2001, there was a Senate parliamentarian, I think his name was Robert Dove, and he made a ruling that the Senate Republican Majority Leader did not like as it relates to consideration of the George H.W. Bush tax cuts. I think it was a ruling that they had to expire because of the Byrd rule, and that parliamentarian got fired. Usually when there is an opening, the pool of applicants is pretty small. It's probably going to be one of those associate parliamentarians that are working under the parliamentarian, or it's probably going to be someone that has like worked on has worked like Senate Ledge Council, or maybe even like the budget committees.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I see another question, and I promise I'm getting there. I'm curious to talk about the bird rule a little bit more, which admittedly I'm always fascinated by. And there's delightful puns like bird bath, like it's just so it's kind of fun to talk about. But what are some of the significant criticisms of the bird rule? Are there sort of desire to do modifications or revisions or changes to that system or not?
Criticisms of the bird rule, I sort of feel like it's just accepted that it is it is codified into law, and that's how it's going to go through the Senate. I would say filibuster reform, I think, has gotten a lot more oxygen than changes to the bird rule, because the filibuster just kind of slows down things in the Senate, and makes the way to get things done is really through reconciliation, just because of the Senate process and procedures. Yeah, I don't think that there's been much discussion as the bird rule. I think there's been some changes in parliamentarian rulings over the past couple of years. Now you can do two budget resolutions as it relates to spending or tax or debt limit in one calendar year, because Congress has the opportunity to do a catch-up budget resolution and then the current year budget resolution. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just kind of a given. The bird rule is what it is.
Yeah, great. So we had another question on sort of how is understanding the reconciliation process, how could it be helpful to advocates? I think that's probably a lot of the audience here today too. Sort of why is it important? How can understanding the process shape the work that they do from your perspective?
About this, yeah, good question. I think you need to understand the reconciliation process because you need to understand whatever provision that you would like to see enacted into law. You need to understand if it's a policy provision. You need to understand if it's a budgetary provision. And then, you are engaging with staff of these authorizing committees and making the case that, it is a budgetary provision. And ultimately, if let's say that there is divided or there is unified government come early 2025, staff is going to be drafting these bills. And you need to understand the context by what they're dealing with. You need to understand the bird rule. You need to understand kind of the limitations that they're facing and why you may want like this allowable use to a program that may not happen. And so you may have to think of another strategy. Maybe you get the big thing done through reconciliation, but then you go and do a technical amendment through the authorizing process, or you do some sort of appropriations provision to do a perfecting on the policy. So that's, I think, why you need to understand, you could get something really big through reconciliation, but it's not going to be perfect. And then how do you perfect it?
Yeah. And what about from the, sort of congressional side of things? Like what role do advocates, lobbyists, sort of others have on reconciliation? Like is there a role? Is there a logical place to sort of plug in and be engaged? Sort of what was your experience from working on that side of things in terms of how you worked with outside actors?
Yeah, so back in the day, it's when we had the old bank-based system, they were definitely coming up, making the case not to cut their subsidies or to cut them less aggressively. And again, these folks, tended to understand the reconciliation process, budget process. But we also had student groups, making the case about the cost of college and how Pell, used to cover 80% back in 70s and 80s, and now it's less than, I think it's like around 25%. So, to make college more affordable, you need to make increases to the Pell Grants. Also, student groups talking about the burden of student loan debt. So yeah, what is on the table? What are people asking for? That's going to help shape what is going to be advocated for in reconciliation. Um, there's a lot of chat about, how do we support minority serving institutions, HBCUs? Is that going to be on the table if there is a reconciliation measure um, um, in the next 5 to 6 months? Sort of knowing that and knowing, what has been done in the past through reconciliation, what has been proposed, maybe through the authorization process, either College Cost Reduction Act or previous efforts, and then kind of going from there.
Thanks. I have a few more questions, but just wanted to encourage folks. I have about 10-15 more minutes. If you have questions, please enter them. You talked about reconciliation, focus on deficit reduction, tax, budget. I feel like traditionally maybe is reconciliation thought of like a means for deficit reduction. Is that fair to say? But has it been used to increase deficits? Sort of how is that played?
Yeah. I mean, I think, back in the day, I worked for a senator who was from North Dakota, a Democrat from North Dakota, which doesn't happen anymore. And so he, was more of a fiscal conservative type. Reconciliation should be done for deficit reduction. I think, I would say that the debate has shifted, especially because, there's been tax provisions that have been done through reconciliation that have increased the deficit. And, so now you have Democrats coming in wanting spending increases or changes to, policy provisions that are going to cost money. And, now I would say it's not necessarily deficit reduction. It's a way to get things done through the Senate, that, you don't have to go through the hurdles of motions to proceed and the 60 vote hurdles. So yeah, reconciliation used to be done for deficit reduction, get budget numbers aligned, but now it's, I think a way to push through key priorities of administration.
Well, that leads into my next question because I was going to ask about trends that have emerged and how reconciliation has been used. And it seems like from your perspective, it's really about getting stuff through the system. Is that fair to say is there any other trends that have been coming up on what, reconciliation has in reality been doing versus its intended purpose, or it has been sort of a way to break through a lot of partisanship, instead?
Breakthrough partisanship. I think it's a way to like get through, big pieces of an incoming president's agenda. Usually within the first 100 days, if not the first 100 days, within the first year. You saw that with the American Rescue Plan, and then later Inflation Reduction Act with Biden. Sort of saw that in 2017 with Trump when he was inaugurated, the effort to overturn the Affordable Care Act. And then later he came in with the Trump tax cuts. I think partisanship or Congress is what it is. Like, maybe that changes in the new Congress. I doubt it. But it's, a way to unify and the party. If you have unified government, if you have control of House, Senate, and the White House, and to get things done. If it's divided government, that's kind of a different ballgame. That's whoever the new administration is and what they want. They're going to have to. That's a completely different calculus, and probably reconciliation is off the table. I will say too that if you are a congressional staff and it is divided government, you can, if you know the reconciliation process, you can definitely gum up the works. I have worked with staff over the years that have, maybe is not a victory on the front page of the Washington Post, but they have definitely caused heartache and heartburn for, who's ever advocating for reconciliation to move things through. They've made it really hard. And they've done a situation where you ping pong between both the House and the Senate, which is a nightmare situation with reconciliation, because if the House passes something and the Senate's like, doesn't, nope, bird rule will not allow it, it has to go back to the House. And if there's like tricky dynamics in the House and they, the House members don't want to like pass it, then reconciliation is done. And yeah, so you can really cause some trouble if you know what you're doing in terms of reconciliation and how to throw up hurdles.
So that leads me to another question in terms of, if the House and the Senate pass different versions of a reconciliation bill, what happens to the process after that point? Is there more power in the Senate because of the parliamentarian? Can that ultimately squash something? Or, if there's two different versions, is it the typical process that they go to conference and try to work things out? Or how does it work if there are two different reconciliation bills?
It's usually like pre-conference. So, but obviously there's like exceptions to that. I think the most recent one would be like Build Back Better. And so the House put forward a bill that was comprehensive. And then you had some more conservative Democratic senators that were concerned about the price tag, and what you ended up getting was very, very different than Build Back Better. You got the Inflation Reduction Act and not Build Back Better. And I think the House had to essentially take that vote because certain senators dictated, what reconciliation would look like. There's a more specific higher ed type of example. In 2010, we did work closely with the House, with our House counterparts. I was in the Senate, on making sure like we're very closely aligned on what the policy would be. But there was a provision that, a Function 500 Republican analyst found that did not score. It was budget. It was, a policy provision, and successfully struck it out of. There was a bird rule violation raised, and we didn't have the votes to overturn. So it was a surgical strike. That's how these things are. So the Senate bill that ultimately passed was very different than the House bill. And so the House had to come back in and take that edit that the Senate made, because if they didn't, not only would the higher ed title die, but also the healthcare part of the reconciliation, which was a huge deal for the Obama administration, would also die. So yeah, I mean, there's it can get kind of tricky dynamics, and members of Congress elected have to sort of hold their nose and take these votes. But that's, I guess, just the nature of how reconciliation plays out.
All right. As we start to wrap up here, I did want to go back to the first question that was asked, because I think that tends to be a common question, is figuring out if something's budgetary in nature versus policy. And so I'm wondering if there's more we can say there, right? Clearly, there might be sort of incidental policy changes, or policy impacts might be sort of secondary, right? How common is that? I think we've heard you say policy change cannot be the main goal, right? If it is, that's likely to be a violation of the bird rule and it's out of there. But how common, College Cost Reduction Act we talked about, are there other examples where a policy change was secondary? But it's how do we figure that out? What's your perspective on how we determine if something's primary or secondary in this kind of space?
Um, yeah. So the change that was made in 2010.
Parliamentarian, like if you were
Yeah, it is the parliamentarian, and like some of this is like, it's the parliamentarian, and some of this is like it gets wrapped up into like politics and like things that so in 2010, the change that we made, that the surgical strike of the bird rule, it was a merely incidental change. And under different circumstances, I think we could have argued it and won it. But like the parliamentarian at the time, people were showing up at his house protesting, his role in overhauling healthcare. And I think he was very concerned, and like he was making all these decisions that were going the way of, the healthcare bill. And I sort of, I don't want to speak for him, but my sense was like he sort of felt like there needed to be some type of bird rule violation because, Republicans had like given a lot of, raised a lot of issues with the healthcare piece. So we sort of feel like the higher ed title was, the ones that, healthcare was having the party, but the education title, like somehow the cops were called on us. But yeah, it is what is merely incidental. It's pretty much, you're at the mercy of the Senate parliamentarian. But again, having good arguments and strong arguments that staff is making, I think can help. And, the first place to start, I would say too, with like, what is budgetary in nature is just making sure, like looking through old CBO scores. And I think anything as it relates to Title V or Title IV, student financial aid, is going to be a budgetary impact. So knowing income-based repayment, debt forgiveness, Pell, student loans, budgetary impact, what is merely incidental, like, I think it depends on, what the legislation is. And, you could also like amend the legislation to make it appear less merely incidental, or maybe strengthen your argument. But again, like this is all kind of high level conversations that happen, with House and Senate authorizers, and, in the bird bath as well.
That's helpful. And I think I'm hearing too how valuable and important it is to understand the process as an outside actor as well, to be able to also make those arguments, if you feel a certain way about whether something, should be considered or not, or counted or not. Really helpful to fully understand all those budgetary and policy implications of federal student aid policy. Did you rely on advocates or others in the space when you were there to sort of help craft some of those arguments?
Yeah, I mean, we knew, there was an argument that Republicans made in 2010 that eliminating direct loans was not really about the savings. It was about, punishing the banks. And, we went in there and made that, like, listen, the whole title relies on the savings here. To plus up Pell, it's not trying to, punish an industry. It's really about the savings, because we want to put it into Pell, we want to put it into income-based repayment, and put it into other programs that affect college access and completion. And the parliamentarian agreed with us on that. And so, but yeah, I mean, we got the heads up that that would be coming because of outside actors kind of flagged it. And then literally 2 hours later, we get the notice to be down in the parliamentarian's office.
Thank you. We only have a couple minutes left, so I wanted to ask you sort of for what parting thought would you give to this group, this community of folks in federal post-secondary policy, learning about budget reconciliation, maybe for the first time, maybe just getting a refresher, but sort of is there a parting thought you'd like to leave with them about why this process is so important and why it's important to understand it before we close out?
Yeah, I mean, so why is this process so important? I mean, there's been efforts to, move forward a college affordability, comprehensive higher ed reauthorization bill, but it's kind of stalled. It'll pass the House, but it won't go anywhere in the Senate. Big pieces of legislation that have moved through reconciliation, and it's had considerable effect on student financial aid. So I would read up on that memo that Betsy put in the chat, and I would also sort of just familiarize yourself with Build Back Better, what was discussed. And what was discussed in 2017 when Trump came and did tax reform, to sort of know what may be on the table. It may not be exactly like it was in 2017. It may not be exactly like it was in 2022 when they were drafting Build Back Better, but it's, you're going to see some themes. And, I guess, make the case or think about what you want any kind of legislation to look like, and, know that reconciliation could be a possibility, but also think about like, okay, well, if it's divided government, maybe, I need to look at the appropriations process or the authorizing process too.
Thank you so much, Robyn. I learn something every single time you come to a PNPI event and teach. So thank you for being here. Thanks to everybody for joining us. You'll have seen a poll pop up. We'd like to collect feedback on all our events. We are committed to continuous improvement. So tell us what you thought. But just a couple of housekeeping things. We will send out the recording to everybody who registered in case they couldn't be here live. And then you can have this recording to watch over and over again. I imagine Robyn would be available if you have other specific questions. She's an incredible resource in her space, an incredible colleague. And otherwise, I just wanted to thank everybody again for participating, and have a wonderful weekend.
I think